and a Merry Christmas to you. My name's Anthony Roberts. I'm the director of Colchester Arts Centre, which lives in that little church, St Mary at the Walls, at the top of the High Street, next door to the Mercury Theatre. When the Arts Centre closed on 17th of March this year, I boldly announced that I should not shave again until the Arts Centre reopened. And it hasn't reopened yet. I've ended up with this huge, great beard. But it is very Dickensian, which is very apt for today's performance for you, A Christmas Carol. Now, it's not the first time it's been performed in Colchester, because Charles Dickens himself came and performed it twice, once in 1849 and once in 1851, in a theatre which is now burnt down but used to be on Queen Street in Colchester. If you know Colchester, you go down up the High Street, turn right, down Queen Street, and down about halfway down on the left is what is now a disused bus garage but used to be the Queen Theatre. And there would have been about 2,000 people in this venue. Charles Dickens would have been a big celebrity. It would have been by gaslight, and the atmosphere would have been electric. However, I don't think it'll be any more electric than it is in the front room of my little house with you and me and the story to go with. So I hope you enjoy it. This is chapter 1 of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. This is how it reads. Marley was dead. Dead as a doornail. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial had been signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? They'd been partners for I don't know how many years. Ebenezer Scrooge. Squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel ever struck out generous fire. Secret, self-contained, as solitary as an oyster. The cold within him had frozen his old features, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. External heat or cold had little influence upon Scrooge. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. No wind blew that was bitterer than he, no falling snow more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Nobody ever stopped him in the streets to inquire of him with gladsome looks, "Oh, my dear Scrooge, how are you?" No beggar implored him to bestow a trifle, no child asked of him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever, in all his life, inquired the way to such and such a place. Now, once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge was busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the sound of the people in the court outside stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. Scrooge kept the door of his counting house open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who was busy in some dismal cell beyond, copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but his clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. Scrooge kept the coal box in his room, so as surely as the clerk came in with his shovel, then his master predicted that it would be necessary for him to part. "Merry Christmas, Uncle," came the cheerful voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he'd had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do. Christmas? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? You're rich enough." "Humbug! Every idiot that goes around with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. Christmas? Much good has it ever done you?" "Well, I've always thought of Christmas as a good time," said the nephew. And ever, uncle, although it's never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it. The clerk involuntarily applauded. Immediately sensible of his impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation." Don't be angry, uncle," said the nephew. Come and dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge replied that, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "Well, I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute," said the nephew, "but I shall keep my Christmas humour to the last, and so I say a Merry Christmas to you, uncle." "Good afternoon." His nephew stopped by the outer door to bestow the season's greetings upon the clerk, who returned them cordially. This lunatic, in allowing Scrooge's nephew out, let two other gentlemen in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and they now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. "At Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Do I have the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night." "Oh, no doubt we'll find his liberality well represented by his surviving partner. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this present time." "Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons." "And the union workhouses, are they still in full operation?" "I wish I could say they were not." "Ah, the treadmill and the poor law, both in full vigour then?" "Both very busy, sir. A few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and some means of warmth. What can we put you down for?" "Nothing." "You wish to remain anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seen clearly, it would be useless to pursue their point. The gentlemen withdrew, and Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived, and with an ill will Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to his clerk, who instantly snuffed out his candle and put on his hat. "You'll be wanting all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly and observed that it was just once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pockets every 25th of December, said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you should have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long white tails of his comforter hanging below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill 20 times in honour of its being Christmas Eve. Hey, whoa! Scrooge took his usual melancholy meal in his usual melancholy tavern before going home to the chambers that once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, in a lowering pile of a building up a yard where the fog and frost hung about the black old gateway to the house. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it every night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought upon Marley since his mention of his 7 years deceased partner that afternoon. So now let any man explain to me, if they can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without it undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. It wasn't an impenetrable shadow like the other objects in the yard were, but had about it a dismal light, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It wasn't angry or ferocious, but looked upon Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon ghostly forehead. As Scrooge stared fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and the nuts which held the knocker on, and Scrooge closed it with a bang. The sound resounded round the house like thunder, but Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes, and he fastened the lock, walked across the hall and up the stairs, trimming his candle as he went. But before he closed the heavy door of his bedroom, he walked his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough of a recollection of the face to desire to do that. Bedroom, sitting room, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the settee, nobody under the bed. "Humbug!" said Scrooge, closed the heavy door of his bedroom and walked his room. After several turns, he sat down, whereupon his eye happened to rest upon a bell. It was a disused bell that hung in the corner of the room and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the uppermost story of the building. It was with great astonishment and a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked upon that bell, it began to swing. It swung so softly at the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did all the bells in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together, and were succeeded by a clanking sound, like the sound of a person dragging a heavy chain. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and he heard the sound much louder coming up the stairs, now coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still, I won't believe it," but his colour changed when, without a pause, it passed through the door and into the room before his eyes. The same face, the very same. Marley! And his pigtails, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels of the latter bristling like his pigtails, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain that he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made up of cash boxes, keys and padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. Scrooge was as caustic and as cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "You don't believe in me?" observed the ghost. I don't." "Why do you doubt your senses?" Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You might be a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Humbug, I say, humbug!" At this the spirit raised such a fearful cry and shook his chains with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge hung on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage that was wound about his head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, his lower jaw dropped down upon his breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Have mercy, dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?" "I do, I must," said Scrooge imploringly. "Oh, Jacob Marley, speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none. That comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other types of men. A very little more is all that is permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger. Mark me! In life, my spirit never left our counting house, and weary journeys lie before me." At this, the spirit held up his chain at arm's length, as if that was the cause of all his unavailing woe, and then he flung it heavily on the ground again. "Hear me!" cried the ghost. "I'm here tonight to warn you. You yet have a chance and a hope of escaping my fate. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. I think," said Scrooge, I think I'd rather not. "Without their visits you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tonight when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I have them all together and take it together, Jacob? Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, and the third upon the last night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." When he had said these words, the phantom took his wrapper from the table and bound it round his head as before. The apparition then walked backwards from Scrooge, and with each step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the apparition reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned for Scrooge to approach. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost raised his hand, warning Scrooge to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he'd become conscious of confused noises in the air. Incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. After listening for a moment, the spectre joined in the mournful dirge, and then he floated out into the bleak, dark night. Scrooge hastened to the window, desperate in his curiosity, and looked out. The air was filled with phantoms. Some were linked together, but none were free. The misery that was within them all was clearly that they sought to interfere in human matters for good, but had lost their power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell, but they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night was once again as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was locked, double locked, as he had locked it with his own hand, and the bolts remained undisturbed. He tried to say, "Hum," but stopped after the first syllable. And whether because of the fatigues of the day, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the emotions he'd undergone, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Thank you very much. That's the end of chapter 1 of Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I do hope you enjoyed that, and a Merry Christmas to each and every one of you.